Why, hello everybody, it's Histor-Tea time! Look, I got a new mug! Alright, so this is Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, featuring the best dogs on the face of the earth. Corgis! Look at the fluffy butt, oh my god! Yes, perfect for Histor-Tea time. It's hot. Ooh. Welcome back, everybody, for some more Histor-Tea time with your favorite historian. It's me, Miss Mullins. Okay, so to continue with the greatest events of World War II, today we're doing the attack on Pearl Harbor, because yes, this is when the United States, decide to get involved in World War II, because, well, I mean, they attacked us, so, you know. Okay, so, again, I want to reiterate a few things. One, that the U.S. did not want to get involved in World War II. Europe had been fighting since 1939. It is now 1940-41. We are like, nope, not into it, fam. We don't want to do it. So when 1941 finally rolls around, the World War II has been going on for years at this point. We are still like, I don't want to do it. We are also dealing with our own depression. We're like, I don't want to do it anymore. God, why? But then Japanese, gunboats, Japanese dive bombers, they just annihilate Pearl Harbor. And I'll tell you all the little details about it as to why it was such a big deal and why certain things happened that way. Also, another thing to keep in mind, World War II is often just, there's this big overarching image of just Nazis in Europe. While that is a huge portion of World War II, it's not the only portion of World War II. World War II is a two-theater war. So you had the European theater, and then you had the Pacific theater. And that mainly involves Japan and their desperate need to expand their empire, and they were slowly taking back countries in Asia that was colonized by Europeans during their age of imperialism. So they actually made their own concentration camps too, and they were really nasty to their prisoners of war. So a POW, by the way, is a prisoner of war, anybody that they captured. So, now that you have some background knowledge, let's get into the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, setting the stage. After Japan won the Japanese-Russo War in 1905, which, by the way, Japan fought Russia, and Japan won. I just want to put that in your brain. You know how big Russia is, and you know how tiny Japan is in comparison. Somehow, Japan pulled it off, and they won. They were actually very militarized, and they were pretty mechanized, too, for that early part of the 20th century. So, yeah. Japan believed that they should begin to be taken seriously as a world power by the West. And during World War I, Japan teamed up with Britain and actually helped the Allies gain huge victories. So, a lot of people are kind of confused when they look at Japan's history and involvement in both the World Wars, because in World War I, they were on the Allies' side. They were on our side. But in World War II, they were on the Axis coalition. So, they're just kind of like, well, that's weird. Why would they switch sides in a matter of 15 years? Well, I'll explain. So Japan was actually invited to join the League of Nations, which was set up after World War I. This was the whole idea to prevent future world wars. It didn't work out, did it? So while Japan was invited, but when they asked for free immigration to Western countries like the US and Australia, they were denied. So as you can imagine, Japan was pretty upset when they left the meeting of the whole formation of the League of Nations. So Japan decides to turn its feudal society into a very parliamentary democracy. So it's trying to modernize its way of government and its way of ruling. This is their hope to align themselves with the Western powers. However, it didn't really matter much because, as my PowerPoint says, in the late 20s, President Calvin Coolidge at the time, he signs a bill that prevents immigration of all non-whites to the United States, and he specifically states Japanese. So he's not allowing anybody to come in. Some people think this was obviously very stupid. Regardless of what you think about the immigration laws, that's what happened. Now, do it with me. Are you ready? Hallowed historical moment. When America's stock market crashed in 1929, it had a global impact and it hit Japan really hard. The demand for silk and any foreign luxury items dropped, and it hurt the Japanese economy a lot. Several accounts of desperate Japanese farmers were selling their daughters into prostitution were found. There was a far-right nationalist government that started to form. It was a huge movement, and it's the idea that they were kind of inspired by ancient samurai codes, and so they thought that bringing back these old ways were actually going to launch them further into the future, make them even stronger. So this leads to the decision to place Hideki Tojo in charge. Now, if you saw my overview of World War II PowerPoint, which was done in 2 parts, so 2 videos, he's very militaristic. He thinks purely in militaristic ways. He makes military type decisions, and he thinks that every solution every problem is somehow going to be solved with a military solution, even if it's not a military type problem. It doesn't matter. That's just how this person, Tojo, thinks. So Tojo is key to the ideology and decides to lead the military into invading colonies of European countries like the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. Now, all of these areas were owned by the Dutch, the British, and we owned the Philippines, the French. So, yeah, literally, again, all of Europe was involved. So in 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, China, and because it needs resources like oil and other resources, they decide to begin their military campaign to take back the Pacific, because they believed that Asia is only for the Asiatics. Now, believe me, that was going to be hard to do, because during the age of imperialism, which kind of happened for like centuries, but there was a huge surge in imperialism pretty much right after the Age of Discovery, and the European powers were going everywhere and taking territory all over the place. So, yes. So there was an international summit that was called, and the Western nations agreed to actually help China defend against Japan. And Japan was so mad. They were thinking, well, this is like, you're hypocrites, because you guys can come in and expand. You guys can come over here and make and create colonies and make them work and pay taxes to you guys, but we can't. So that obviously left them very upset. And one could think, I get it. Like that is kind of hypocritical of us to think that way and to order them that way. So 1937 dawns. We have the rape of Nanking, which is the systematic murder of 300,000 unarmed soldiers and civilians. And yes, it was disgusting and terrible. Again, if you saw my World War II overview PowerPoint, there were pictures included of that, and it was again all out of resources and just the desire to expand. So, stay with me. Are you ready? Hallowed historical moment. Japan signs the pact to join the Axis powers, and if you don't remember what the Axis powers were, that was Germany and Italy and the Soviet Union at the time. The Soviet Union is going to leave the Axis coalition later, but for right now, they're part of it. Then they get Japan. Da, 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 da. So, now we're going to shift. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain at this point. He's actually very nervous when he sees all these world powers joining forces, and his fear of a very Nazi-ruled Europe is real. Because not only is Britain pretty much by itself against Hitler and all of his forces, he's losing any kind of aid because the Nazis are conquering them and then occupying them, and then they are taking their militaries that they've conquered and then using it themselves. That's why Churchill makes the decision to kind of destroy the French fleet off the coast of Algiers, which I talked about in my other video for the Battle of Britain. So he tries to urge the USA to join, but FDR was like, no. FDR, by the way, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's the president of the United States during this time. He says no. Considering that the fact that he pretty much promised that he wouldn't get the USA into war, I mean, like, most of his campaign was pretty much built on this promise, he decides to do pretty much everything short of sending troops over to fight the war. He sends a lot of supplies to the Allies. He sends planes, tanks, ammunition, oil, anything that the Allies would need to hold out as long as possible. Now, there's quite a few of these for the attack on Pearl Harbor, so do it again. Ready? Hallowed historical moment. FDR makes a very risky decision. on purpose. So now here's where we insert the idea of a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is that people think that FDR allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. I can neither confirm nor deny that information. I don't have a sheet of paper that tells me that FDR knew that the Japanese were going to attack. But as you can see from this PowerPoint, all the information that I have for you, that we have collected, that is absolute for sure evidence of a lot of things, it's not hard to think that he knew, because it seems like they just ignored a lot of things. But we'll get into it. He orders the Pacific Fleet to be stationed at Pearl Harbor. A lot of his military leaders that he, military advisors, if you will, they don't agree with that. Specifically, Admiral Richardson. He actually loses his position in the Navy as the admiral over his really harsh disagreement with FDR. He pretty much cursed FDR out and told him that he was an idiot, because he was like, why are you going to put the entire Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, or should I say Hawaii, because that's how you correctly say it. Why are you going to put them there? They're far away from literally everything, and they're out in the Pacific. The closest thing to them is Midway, which we'll get into Midway. So it doesn't seem like a smart decision. And so he loses his position over pretty much telling the president that he's an idiot. Okay, so this is what Pearl Harbor, this is what it looks like. So right here we have Battleship Row. And these are all the different battleships, hence the name, that were in the Pacific Fleet. We also have different aircraft carriers. Thankfully, though, at the attack of Pearl Harbor, the aircraft carriers weren't actually at Pearl Harbor. They were away. They were not yet at Pearl Harbor. So all of this stuff is pretty much just battleships. And we have airfields and places where they were storing any of their bomber planes, their fighter planes. So it's a big base, and it's a lot of territory. Now here's the thing about Pearl Harbor. The soldiers actually thought it was a pretty safe place because it's able to defend itself. One, the military installations were huge, and the geography is actually natural protection. So the mountains and the shallowness of the harbor is very important. Its shallow depth prevents it from torpedo attacks because of how deep the torpedoes actually have to descend into the water when they're dropped before they detonate. Okay, because of how shallow Pearl Harbor was, it wasn't going to happen. It would almost like drop beneath the depths of half of their harbor, so it wouldn't even really affect them. And then because of the mountains, it kind of created this natural barrier that would protect them. So most people were never really in the idea of anticipating attack. Like, they didn't think that attack was so close. Now we're going to kind of jump to the Japanese side. So the head of the Japanese Navy was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He spent 2 tours in America and actually knew who his military was up against. And he thought it was actually really silly for Tojo to align himself with Hitler and Mussolini because that could draw the United States into war. So essentially what I'm saying is once Hideki Tojo signed the pact to join the Axis powers, this guy, Admiral Yamamoto, thought it was really stupid and quite a huge mistake because he knows that America is allies with Britain and with like 90% of all the European nations that are like getting conquered at the time through Britain. So he knew that it'd be very risky because the United States would eventually be drawn into it. And he wasn't wrong, right? I mean, it does happen. So when Hitler takes France and Holland, this leaves their colonies in Asia open for the taking, and Japan does exactly that. So France, I think, owned, they pretty much owned Southeast China, or Southeast Asia, I think, that whole area. And then Holland owned some colonies over there as well. So once Japan goes over there and takes all this territory, FDR decides to suspend the oil exports to Japan so that so then the Japanese turn to the Dutch East Indies. So, which is kind of dangerous though, because there's a lot. Anyway, I'll get into it. Okay? So, Yamamoto was told to act. Instead of attacking the U.S. Philippines, he knows he wouldn't actually make a huge hit for the U.S. military if he just went to the Philippines, because the Philippines was so far out over there, and it was a small territory. He doesn't actually think it's going to do much, because we don't really have a lot stored there. It's not a massive base like Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto realizes that he needs to go for the jugular, so to speak, which is our Pacific Fleet. If he can take out our entire Pacific Fleet, then what are we going to do? They're going to attack us, and we're just going to be left on the map. We can't get back up. We literally can't get back up, at least not for a while. You know, we're going to be down. So, and of course, once Yamamoto figures out that the entire Pacific Fleet is pretty much sitting in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at Hawaii, he's just like, oh, this is such a perfect opportunity. Gee, imagine that. Now, one more time. You ready? Hallowed historical moment. 10 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a dispatch comes from D.C. and states that the message is a war warning and lists a number of possible attack locations, but Pearl Harbor was never mentioned. So the new guy that takes over after Admiral Richardson was fired because he told FDR that he was stupid, is Admiral Kimmel. He's the new commander of the Pacific Fleet. And then as far as the land forces, like the Army and stuff, we have U.S. General Short, and he actually anticipates attack from inside the island, so he orders all the aircrafts to be stationed on the main tarmac and to be guarded 24/7. Now, you might think this is a very good idea, but in actuality, this is a terrible idea, and you're going to see exactly why. So, was there someone on the inside? Yes, there was. This is a problem. So while General Short was kind of like the whole airfield, or putting all the aircrafts on one tarmac, wasn't very smart, he was right in the fact that the attack was going to come in from the inside. But it kind of comes in from every side because there's spies in Hawaii right now. We have at least one confirmed. We have Japanese citizen. He was Takeo Yoshikawa. He was a spy sending pictures day by day movement of the airplanes and the ships at Pearl Harbor. And so what he was doing, he was sending that all to the Japanese military, and now they had all the details that they could ever need to attack Pearl Harbor. Now, moving up. 4 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese begin to destroy all documents and coding machines. And the U.S. finds out about it. So it's not like we didn't know, but they started to destroy all this stuff. Now, Admiral Kimmel, at the time, remember I told you he was the guy in charge of the Pacific Fleet, he thought that it was because they were anticipating the U.S. to attack and they wanted to look like it was unwarranted, right? So it's like, oh, hey, the United States just attacked us out of nowhere. We weren't doing anything. So that's what Admiral Kimmel thinks. Boy, was he wrong. So, on December 7th, 1941, 7 a.m., radar on Oahu, yes, I think that's how I say it, yes, detects a blob of planes, and they call to hire, and they're actually told to ignore the planes. They're like, oh, it's probably just naval planes practicing. However, it's Sunday. So December 7th in 1941 was on a Sunday, so no training was going on, so it was actually pretty suspicious. And so 183 planes managed to soar overhead, and the Americans at Pearl Harbor are very unsettled. They're just like, that's weird, because it's Sunday. What are we doing on a Sunday? We're not supposed to be doing anything. Most of the soldiers were just chilling at the base. They weren't really doing much. Some of them were in church. I mean, not really much going on. And then catastrophe hits. So, do it with me. Hallowed historical moment. Japanese begin bombing the airfields, and they hit the tarmac, and that prevents Americans from counter-striking. And then they go for Battleship Row. So not only can we not even get to the gunboats, we can't get to anything to protect ourselves, we can't even get into the planes to then counterattack their air force. We can't do anything. We're literally sitting ducks at this point. So within minutes, Pearl Harbor goes up in flames. And the Japanese created a new type of torpedo that didn't have to descend that deep either. So what they did was they had to make these, it's like wooden panels that would come out on the side of the torpedo. And so what it did was it would prevent it from sinking so deep. So it allowed it to only sink so far and then, you know, have its trajectory actually hit Pearl, like the harbor itself. And it would actually ignite. It would, you know, blow up upon impact. So they were really, they were really preparing for this attack to be insane. Now here's a kicker, okay? 30 minutes prior to the massive catastrophic attack, Admiral Kimmel received a phone call that the attacks, the Americans destroyed a Japanese submarine 30 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. There was a Japanese submarine in the waters, okay, of American territory, right outside of Pearl Harbor. And he doesn't do anything to prepare. He doesn't think anything of it. And so after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, he's recorded to have said how much better it would have been to have been killed by one of the bombs. Because Kimmel realizes that he's made a massive mistake with just pure complacency and not even realizing how imminent the attack was. So 9:45 a.m., the attack is over. Truly a day that will live in infamy. So, that's a quote from FDR's speech. So, total damage, let's assess everything. 328 aircrafts are destroyed, 19 ships are wrecked, and 2,403 Americans are dead. Within 24 hours, Japan, after attacking us, within 24 hours, Japan turns and attacks Hong Kong and other Western-owned colonies because they know that we can't sail off to the rescue because we don't have anything. They destroyed it all. Now, what's interesting here is Admiral Yamamoto falls into a serious depression because his attack went perfectly except for one important thing. And don't worry, we're going to see Admiral Yamamoto again. The Japanese bombers completely missed the aircraft carriers, which thankfully were not stationed at Pearl Harbor. Again, it's almost like certain things just kind of happened by chance. But it's true. The aircraft carriers are essential. You need these because, one, they're aircraft carriers. They're like floating armed cities. And it's important to know that if he were to take out all of that, that would have eliminated all of the U.S. military forces' capabilities right there. So he's pretty depressed. And to add more salt to his wound, he's also upset because the Americans, as far as like his public, are not responding how his colleagues over in Japan, like Hideki Tojo and the Emperor and everything, thought that they were going to respond, which he knew was bound to happen. America was actually like overflowing with people signing up to join the war, and they were ready to commit to total war. So he thought that the Americans would be defeated. He thought that the Americans would be like, oh my gosh, we've lost everything. This is so bad. What are we going to do? No, instead we were like, oh, I don't think so. And we were like, all right, Japan, that's how you want it? Fine. And so then literally everybody that could joined the war, or joined the military. And they were ready. They were like, okay, that's it. We're going to take them. So interestingly enough, when Winston Churchill heard of the attack, he actually, he wrote in his memoirs that at that evening, when he went to bed, he said to himself, we may have actually won the war now. Which is very interesting because he knew the power of the U.S. He knew that with the United States joining the war, that they would actually have a fighting chance, and that Nazi Europe could be stopped. You know? So it's an interesting thing. Like, yes, it was such a big blow to us, but can you imagine how that would feel to Churchill or to anybody over there thinking, wow, the people that kind of like helped out a lot in World War I, oh my gosh, can't wait for them to show up. You know, it's interesting. It's very interesting. So President FDR declares war on Japan, and then, of course, because, you know, at the time, Japan was part of the Axis coalition, Hitler declares war on the United States, and this is how the United States becomes involved in a two-theater war. Bam. You're welcome. That was amazing. I think that went flawlessly. What do you think? I think it went well. So thank you again for joining me on another episode of Histor-Tea Time with your favorite historian.